Picture this, 262 American fighters, outnumbered nearly 2-1, deliberately flying into what every pilot knew was a death trap. Above them, 400 of Nazi Germany's most lethal aces circled like vultures, their engines warming for what should have been the easiest turkey shoot of the war. The trap was perfect. The bait was irresistible. And in just a few hours, the hunters would become the hunted in the most savage aerial battle ever fought over the Reich's capital. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing: this wasn't just any ordinary mission gone wrong. This was a calculated gamble that would either save the Allied bombing campaign or destroy it completely. The stakes? Nothing less than the outcome of World War II itself. Because on March 6, 1944, in the blood-soaked skies over Berlin, a single day of combat would shatter the backbone of Hitler's air force so completely that Germany would never recover. I'm about to take you inside the cockpits of both sides during those terrifying hours when death stalked every cloud and survival measured in split seconds. You'll hear the actual radio transmissions, feel the G-forces that crushed pilots into their seats, and witness the moment when American engineering and raw courage collided with German desperation in a battle that literally changed the course of history. But before we dive into this incredible story, do me a massive favor and smash that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear is so intense, so packed with unbelievable details, that you'll want to experience every single video we create about the most insane moments in military history. Trust me, once you hear what happened next, you'll understand why this single day in 1944 still gives aviation historians nightmares. The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned grey and bitter cold across the airfields of England. At bases scattered throughout East Anglia, nearly 700 American bombers sat on frozen runways like sleeping giants, their aluminum skin glistening with frost. These weren't just any bombers, they were flying fortresses and liberators, each one carrying enough high explosive to level a city block. But today, they had their sights set on something far more ambitious: the industrial heart of Nazi Germany itself. As ground crews swarmed over the aircraft, checking engines and loading ammunition, a smaller group of fighters prepared for what every man knew could be his final mission. 262 P-51 Mustangs, their silver fuselages gleaming like polished daggers, represented the cutting edge of American aviation technology. But technology alone wouldn't save them from what was waiting in the skies over Berlin. Inside the briefing rooms, the atmosphere was electric with nervous tension. Weather officers spread out reconnaissance photos showing thick cloud cover over the target area, perfect concealment for German fighters lying in ambush. Intelligence officers delivered the sobering truth: radar stations across occupied Europe had already detected unusual Luftwaffe activity. Something big was building up over the Reich, and every indication suggested the Germans were preparing for the fight of their lives. Squadron commanders stood before maps riddled with red pins marking known anti-aircraft positions and fighter bases. The numbers were staggering: over 400 German fighters were estimated to be operational in the Berlin defense sector alone. That meant the escorting Mustangs would be facing odds of nearly 2-1, and that was before factoring in the home field advantage, superior altitude, and the desperate fury of men fighting for their homeland. But the most chilling part of the briefing came when the mission commander stepped forward and delivered words that would haunt every pilot for the rest of his life: "Gentlemen, Berlin has never been successfully bombed in daylight. Today, we're going to change that. And if we fail, there may not be enough of us left to try again." The silence in that room was deafening. These weren't green recruits fresh from flight training, these were battle-hardened veterans who had survived the meat grinder of air combat over Europe. They had seen friends die in flames, watched bombers spiral earthward trailing smoke and screaming men. They knew exactly what they were flying into, and they knew that for many of them, this morning's breakfast would be their last. As the briefing broke up, pilots walked in small groups toward their aircraft, their conversations hushed and tense. Some wrote quick letters home, others checked and rechecked their equipment with the obsessive precision of men who understood that a jammed gun or faulty radio could mean the difference between life and death. The Lucky Charms came out with photos of sweethearts, rabbit's feet, religious medals, anything that might tip the scales of fate in their favor. Meanwhile, 500 miles to the east, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. Across dozens of Luftwaffe bases scattered throughout occupied Europe, German pilots were strapping themselves into fighters that represented the accumulated expertise of a nation that had perfected the art of aerial warfare. These weren't the fresh-faced youngsters who had been thrown into combat during the desperate battles of 1943. These were survivors, the hardened veterans who had lived through the horror of the Eastern Front and the brutal attrition of the Western Air War. Their aircraft told the story of Germany's technological prowess. The Bf-109 Gustav, despite being an evolution of a pre-war design, remained one of the most deadly interceptors in the world. Its cannon could shred a bomber with a single burst, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it could outmaneuver almost anything the Allies could put in the sky. The FW-190 Werger, the Butcher Bird, was even more fearsome, a radial engine monster that combined devastating firepower with armor protection that could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters. But the real advantage the Germans possessed wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. These men were fighting over their own homes, their own families. For them, this wasn't just another mission, it was a desperate last stand against an enemy that threatened everything they held dear. The propaganda machine had filled them with stories of Allied terror bombing, of innocent civilians burned alive in their homes. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories had turned every German pilot into a man with nothing left to lose. The tactical situation heavily favored the defenders. German radar stations stretching from Norway to the Mediterranean had been tracking the American formation from the moment it left English airspace. Controllers in concrete bunkers deep beneath Berlin had hours to position their fighters at optimal altitudes and attack vectors. They could choose the time, place, and manner of engagement, while the Americans were locked into a predictable flight path that would take them directly through the heaviest concentration of air defenses in Europe. As the first American engines roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness, German pilots were already climbing toward their patrol altitudes. The trap was being set with mechanical precision. Fighter squadrons took positions at different altitudes, creating a layered defense that would force the Americans to fight on multiple levels simultaneously. The plan was simple in its brutal efficiency: let the bombers penetrate deep into German airspace, then unleash every available fighter in a coordinated assault designed to destroy the entire formation before it could reach its target. What the Germans didn't know was that they were facing something completely new in the air war, a fighter that would revolutionize everything they thought they understood about aerial combat. The P-51 Mustang represented more than just American industrial might, it embodied a fundamental shift in the nature of air warfare itself. The story of how the Mustang came to dominate the skies is itself a tale of international cooperation and technological breakthrough that reads like fiction. In 1940, as Britain fought for its survival during the Blitz, the Royal Air Force desperately needed more fighters. American aircraft manufacturers were eager to help, but their initial offerings were disappointingly inadequate for the high-altitude combat that characterized the European air war. North American aviation had designed the P-51 around the Allison V-1710 engine, a power plant that performed adequately at low altitudes but lost effectiveness rapidly as altitude increased. The first Mustangs delivered to Britain were relegated to ground attack and reconnaissance roles, their potential as air superiority fighters seemingly limited by fundamental engineering constraints. But British engineers saw something in the Mustang's airframe that American designers had missed. The aircraft's aerodynamic efficiency was extraordinary, its laminar flow wing design created less drag than any fighter in production. If they could solve the power problem, they realized they might have stumbled onto something revolutionary. The solution came in the form of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. When British engineers mated the Merlin to the Mustang's airframe, they created something unprecedented in aviation history, a long-range escort fighter that could not only reach any target in Europe but could outfight anything it encountered along the way. The transformation was stunning. The new P-51 B and C models could cruise at speeds that exceeded the maximum velocity of many German fighters. They could climb to altitudes where the thin air defeated most enemy interceptors. Most importantly, they had the range to escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and still have enough fuel for extended combat operations. But raw performance was only part of the equation. The Mustang's real advantage lay in its armament and pilot training. 6.50 caliber machine guns gave it devastating firepower at any range, while American pilots had been trained in tactics specifically designed to exploit the aircraft's superior performance characteristics. They had learned to use the Mustang's speed to control the terms of engagement, diving on German formations and then using their velocity advantage to escape before the enemy could respond effectively. The psychological impact on German pilots was enormous. For years, they had enjoyed technological superiority over their opponents. Suddenly, they found themselves facing an enemy aircraft that was faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed than anything in their inventory. Worse, these aircraft were flown by pilots who had been specifically trained to exploit every advantage their machines provided. By early 1944, the Mustang had begun to tip the balance of the air war in favor of the Allies. German fighter pilots, who had once attacked bomber formations with confidence, now found themselves hunted by escorts that could pursue them anywhere they tried to flee. The psychological effect was devastating. Knowing that American fighters could appear anywhere, at any time, fundamentally changed how the Luftwaffe approached air combat. Now, as hundreds of engines reached operating temperature on both sides of the English Channel, the stage was set for what would become the most decisive aerial battle of the European War. The Americans were betting everything on a single massive strike designed to demonstrate that nowhere in Germany was safe from Allied bombers. The Germans were prepared to sacrifice their entire fighter force if necessary to prove that the Reich could still defend itself. At 0800 hours, the first bombers began rolling down English runways, their fully loaded weight straining against the pull of gravity. One by one, flying fortresses and liberators clawed their way into the gray morning sky, their bomb bays packed with high explosives destined for aircraft factories, rail yards, and industrial complexes around Berlin. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying, a river of aluminum and steel flowing eastward toward what everyone knew would be the most heavily defended target in Europe. The Mustang escorts took off in perfect formation, their pilots running through final systems checks as they climbed toward their assigned altitudes. Radio chatter was crisp and professional, but experienced ears could detect the underlying tension in every transmission. These men knew they were flying into history, and they understood that not all of them would be coming home. As the massive formation crossed the English Channel, German radar operators watched its progress with growing excitement. This was exactly what they had been waiting for, a concentrated American attack that would allow them to bring their entire defensive force to bear in a single, decisive engagement. Controllers began directing fighter squadrons toward predetermined intercept points, their voices calm and efficient as they orchestrated what they hoped would be the destruction of American strategic bombing capability. The weather over Europe was typical for early March: broken clouds, intermittent visibility, and winds that varied dramatically with altitude. These conditions would prove crucial to the coming battle, providing concealment for ambush while simultaneously making formation flying treacherous for both sides. Pilots found themselves constantly adjusting throttles and control surfaces to maintain position, their attention divided between navigation and the constant search for enemy aircraft. I need to pause here for just a moment because what happens next is so incredibly intense that you're going to want to make sure you don't miss a single detail. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, hit that like button right now. It helps the YouTube algorithm understand that we're creating content you actually want to see, which means more incredible stories like this one. We've got an entire library of the most insane military history you've ever heard, and that little thumbs up tells us we're on the right track. Also, make sure you've got notifications turned on because we drop new videos every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what we have coming up. Now, let's get back to March 6, 1944, because we're about to witness one of the most savage aerial battles in history. As the American formation penetrated deeper into German airspace, the first signs of enemy activity began appearing on radar screens and in pilot reports. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the bombers from a distance, radioing precise position reports back to Luftwaffe controllers. These were the eyes of the German air defense system, carefully tracking every movement of the approaching Allied force while staying safely out of range of the escort fighters. The tension inside American cockpits was becoming almost unbearable. Pilots scanned empty sky that they knew concealed hundreds of enemy fighters, their heads constantly moving as they searched for the first sign of attack. Radio discipline remained excellent, but the frequency of routine check-ins increased as squadron commanders tried to maintain awareness of their scattered formations. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and brutally cold. Despite heated cockpits and electrically warmed flight suits, pilots found themselves fighting the numbing effects of high-altitude exposure. Oxygen masks created a constant mechanical rhythm of breathing that became the soundtrack to their growing anxiety. Every cloud formation could hide an attacking fighter, every contrail might signal the beginning of the battle for their lives. The German response was building with methodical precision. Fighter squadrons from bases across northern Germany were converging on Berlin, their pilots climbing toward attack altitudes while ground controllers provided continuous updates on the American formation's progress. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: allow the bombers to penetrate deep enough into German territory that they couldn't easily escape, then hit them with everything available in a coordinated assault designed to achieve maximum destruction in minimum time. What made this particular engagement so crucial was timing. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing severe shortages of both fuel and experienced pilots. The massive air battles of 1943 had decimated German fighter squadrons, forcing training programs to graduate pilots with barely adequate flight time and almost no combat experience. This mission represented one of the last opportunities for the German Air Force to achieve a decisive victory using concentrated strength rather than the piecemeal resistance that had characterized recent operations. The stakes couldn't have been higher for either side. For the Americans, failure would validate German claims that strategic bombing was ineffective and prohibitively expensive in lives and resources. Congressional support for the daylight bombing campaign was already wavering in the face of mounting casualties, and another disaster like the Schweinfurt raids could potentially force a complete reconsideration of Allied strategy in Europe. For the Germans, this battle represented perhaps the final chance to demonstrate that the Reich could still defend itself against Allied aggression. Every available fighter had been committed to the operation, stripping defenses from other sectors and gambling everything on a single massive engagement. If they failed to achieve a decisive victory, German air defenses might never again be strong enough to seriously threaten Allied bomber formations. As the American formation approached the outskirts of Berlin, the first visual contacts began. High above the bomber stream, tiny metallic glints caught the sunlight, German fighters positioning themselves for attack. The escort Mustangs immediately began climbing toward these threats, their pilots knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the mission succeeded or ended in catastrophe. The initial contact came without warning. A formation of FW-190s dove out of the sun, their cannon shells creating deadly streams of light as they tore through the American formation. The radio exploded with urgent calls, bandits diving, 2 o'clock high. Blue leader, break left, break left. I'm hit, I'm going down. The orderly progression of the mission dissolved instantly into chaos as hundreds of aircraft scattered across the sky in desperate attempts to survive the opening moments of combat. What happened next defied every prediction and battle plan. Instead of the systematic destruction of the American formation that German commanders had anticipated, the Mustang escorts turned the attack into a savage melee that spread across hundreds of square miles of sky. American pilots, trained to exploit their aircraft's superior performance, used speed and altitude to break up German attack formations before they could concentrate their fire on the vulnerable bombers. The first German fighters to attack found themselves facing something they had never encountered before: escort fighters that not only refused to be driven away from the bomber stream but actively pursued attacking interceptors into prolonged combat. Previous American escorts had been forced to maintain close formation with the bombers, limiting their tactical flexibility. The Mustang's superior range and performance allowed its pilots to range far from the bomber stream, intercepting German fighters before they could reach their targets. Individual combat spread across the sky like wildfire. A Mustang pilot spotted a Bf-109 climbing toward the bomber formation and dove to intercept, his 6 machine guns chattering as he closed to point-blank range. The German fighter exploded in a ball of flame, but 2 more 109s were already diving on the American from above. The Mustang pilot rolled inverted and dove vertically, using his aircraft's superior high-speed handling to escape the trap, then pulled up in a climbing turn that brought him onto the tail of one pursuer. The radio frequencies became a nightmare of overlapping transmissions as pilots called out threats, coordinated attacks, and screamed for help. Mustang on my 6, get him off me. Roger, I'm coming in high. 2 bandits at 11 o'clock, engaging. The professional calm of the pre-mission briefings had dissolved into the raw emotional chaos of aerial combat at its most intense. German pilots found themselves fighting a completely different kind of battle than they had expected. Instead of making quick attack passes against helpless bombers and then escaping before escort fighters could respond, they were locked in prolonged dogfights with aircraft that could match or exceed their performance at every altitude. The psychological impact was devastating. These were men who had been trained to believe in German technological superiority, and suddenly they were facing an enemy that had not only matched their capabilities but exceeded them. The bomber crews, meanwhile, continued their steady progression toward the target, their gunners adding to the chaos with streams of defensive fire that filled the sky with tracers. B-17 and B-24 formations maintained their disciplined formations even as German fighters slashed through their ranks, their pilots knowing that breaking formation would mean certain death in the face of concentrated fighter attacks. But the most remarkable aspect of the battle was its sheer scale and intensity. This wasn't the kind of limited engagement that had characterized most previous aerial combat. This was total war in 3 dimensions, with hundreds of aircraft locked in simultaneous individual battles that stretched the very definition of organized military action. Pilots found themselves fighting multiple opponents while trying to maintain formation with friendly aircraft and avoid collisions with other combatants in the swirling chaos of high-speed maneuvering. The turning point came when German commanders realized that their carefully planned attack had degenerated into exactly the kind of prolonged engagement that favored American advantages in pilot training and aircraft performance. Instead of the quick, decisive strikes that had been planned, German fighters found themselves trapped in extended dogfights against an enemy that seemed to get stronger as the battle progressed. American squadron commanders began coordinating their scattered formations into more effective fighting units, using radio communications to concentrate multiple fighters against individual German targets. The superior training of American pilots began to show as they implemented tactics specifically designed to exploit the Mustang's advantages while minimizing exposure to German strengths. The psychological momentum of the battle shifted dramatically as German pilots realized they were not only failing to stop the bomber attack but were actually losing the aerial combat. Reports of Mustangs shot down were increasingly balanced by reports of German fighters destroyed, and the realization began to dawn that this engagement was not going according to plan. As the battle raged across the skies over Berlin, both sides began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the air war over Europe. This wasn't just another tactical engagement, this was a fundamental shift in the balance of aerial power that would reshape every subsequent operation. The implications were staggering for both American strategic bombing and German air defense capabilities. The intensity of the combat was beyond anything previously experienced by pilots on either side. Aircraft were destroyed at point-blank range, their debris creating additional hazards for other fighters trying to maneuver in the same airspace. Parachutes began appearing throughout the battle area as pilots from both sides were forced to abandon their aircraft, their survival dependent on the random chance of landing in friendly or enemy territory. Weather began to play an increasingly important role as the battle progressed. Cloud formations that had initially provided concealment for German attacks now became refuges for damaged aircraft trying to escape combat. Visibility changed rapidly as fighters moved between cloud layers, creating opportunities for surprise attacks while simultaneously making formation flying treacherous for both sides. The endurance factor began to favor the Americans as the engagement continued. German fighters, operating at the limits of their fuel capacity, began to face critical decisions about whether to continue fighting or return to base before their tanks ran dry. The Mustangs, with their superior range, could continue combat operations long after German fighters were forced to disengage. Ground controllers on both sides struggled to maintain awareness of the tactical situation as the battle spread across hundreds of square miles of sky. Radio communications became increasingly fragmented as pilots were forced to prioritize immediate survival over routine reporting procedures. The neat organizational charts and battle plans that had seemed so clear during pre-mission briefings dissolved into the fog of combat that characterizes all military operations at their most intense. German radar operators watched in growing alarm as the plots representing their fighter formations began to thin out across their screens. What had started as a concentrated defensive response was rapidly dispersing into individual combats that made coordinated control virtually impossible. The systematic destruction of the American formation that had been the goal of the mission was clearly not happening, and worse, German losses were mounting at an unsustainable rate. American bomber crews pressed onward toward their targets despite the chaos surrounding them. Their discipline and training held formations together even as individual aircraft took damage and fell behind. Gunners continued to engage German fighters that penetrated the escort screen, their .50 caliber machine guns adding to the general mayhem while providing additional protection for their formations. The cumulative effect of hundreds of individual combats began to create a tactical situation that neither side had anticipated. Instead of a clear victory for either the attackers or defenders, the battle was evolving into a mutual bloodletting that would leave both air forces significantly weakened regardless of who could claim technical success. But here's where this story takes an absolutely incredible turn that nobody saw coming, not the American commanders, not the German defenders, and certainly not the pilots fighting for their lives in the chaos above Berlin. Because what started as a conventional air battle was about to become something that would literally rewrite the rules of aerial warfare forever. The German High Command had placed enormous faith in their ability to achieve a decisive victory through concentrated fighter attacks. Their strategy was based on the assumption that American escort fighters, no matter how capable, could not simultaneously protect bomber formations while engaging in prolonged combat with defending interceptors. This assumption was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. As the battle entered its second hour, a new factor began to influence the tactical situation. Fresh American fighter squadrons, held in reserve during the initial engagement, began arriving in the combat area. These reinforcements hadn't expended ammunition or fuel in the opening phases of the battle, giving them crucial advantages over German fighters that had been engaged since the first contact. The arrival of fresh American forces fundamentally changed the character of the engagement. Instead of a declining spiral of attrition that would eventually exhaust both sides, the battle was being renewed with fighters that could exploit the fatigue and ammunition shortages of the German defenders. This was a luxury that the Luftwaffe, operating at the limits of its available strength, simply could not match. German pilots began to realize that they were facing not just superior individual aircraft but a tactical system that could sustain combat operations far longer than their own capabilities allowed. The Americans weren't just winning individual engagements, they were winning the broader strategic battle by demonstrating that they could maintain air superiority over any target they chose to attack. The psychological impact on German morale was devastating. These were men who had been taught to believe that German engineering and fighting spirit could overcome any numerical disadvantage. Suddenly they found themselves not only outnumbered but outclassed by an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and inexhaustible determination. Individual stories of heroism and sacrifice began to emerge from the chaos of combat. A German pilot, his ammunition exhausted and his fighter damaged, deliberately rammed his aircraft into an American bomber in a final act of defiance. An American Mustang pilot, his aircraft crippled by cannon fire, stayed with a damaged bomber formation long enough to drive off attacking fighters before crash landing behind enemy lines. These personal dramas were playing out simultaneously across hundreds of square miles of sky, each one representing the ultimate test of training, courage, and mechanical reliability. The margin between survival and death measured in fractions of seconds, with success or failure often dependent on split-second decisions made under the most intense pressure imaginable. The bombing attack itself continued almost as a secondary consideration to the aerial battle surrounding it. American bomber formations reached their targets and delivered their ordnance with mechanical precision, their crews focused on their specific mission objectives even as the greatest air battle in European history raged around them. The professional competence of these airmen under such extreme conditions represented one of the finest achievements of American military training and leadership. German anti-aircraft defenses added another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation. Heavy flak bursts created additional hazards for all aircraft in the target area, forcing both American bombers and German fighters to navigate through patterns of exploding shells that could destroy any aircraft regardless of nationality. The irony of German defensive fire potentially destroying German fighters was not lost on pilots from either side. As the third hour of combat began, the cumulative effects of prolonged high-altitude combat began to affect pilots from both sides. Oxygen systems strained by combat maneuvering, extreme cold that penetrated even heated cockpits, and the physical exhaustion of sustained G-force exposure all contributed to degraded performance that made survival increasingly dependent on luck rather than skill. The endurance factor that had initially favored American forces was now becoming critical for both sides. German fighters were reaching the limits of their fuel capacity and would soon be forced to disengage regardless of the tactical situation. American aircraft, while possessing superior range, had been engaged in combat for hours and were also approaching the limits of their operational capability. Ground controllers struggled to maintain coherent tactical pictures as the battle area expanded and radio communications became increasingly fragmented. The neat organizational structures that had existed at the beginning of the mission had dissolved into a chaotic mixture of individual combats that made coordinated control virtually impossible for either side. Weather continued to play a crucial role as pilots used cloud cover to escape combat, regroup, and position themselves for renewed attacks. The unpredictable visibility created opportunities for surprise while simultaneously making formation flying dangerous for aircraft trying to maintain mutual support in combat. The human cost of the battle was becoming apparent as parachutes continued to appear throughout the combat area. Pilots from both sides faced the terrifying prospect of bailout over enemy territory, with survival dependent not only on successfully escaping their aircraft but on the random chance of landing near friendly forces. Medical personnel at bases on both sides prepared for casualties, knowing that the scale of the engagement guaranteed that survivors would return with wounds and trauma that would test the limits of available treatment capabilities. The psychological aftermath of such intense combat would affect participants for the rest of their lives, regardless of which side they had fought for. As ammunition supplies dwindled and fuel gauges approached critical levels, pilots began to face increasingly desperate decisions about whether to continue fighting or attempt to return to base. These calculations involved not just mechanical considerations but profound questions about duty, survival, and the ultimate purpose of their sacrifice. The strategic implications of the battle were becoming clear to commanders on both sides even as the tactical situation remained chaotic and unpredictable. This engagement was determining not just the success or failure of a single mission but the future viability of strategic bombing as a tool of Allied strategy. Okay, I have to interrupt this story one more time because we're approaching the climax of what might be the most insane aerial battle in military history, and I want to make sure you're getting the full experience. If you're as blown away by this story as I am, do me a huge favor and share this video with someone who loves incredible military history. Maybe a friend, family member, or anyone who appreciates stories of incredible courage under impossible odds. And hey, while you're at it, check out the other videos on our channel because we've got an entire collection of the most unbelievable military stories you've ever heard. These are the moments that changed history, told with the same level of detail and intensity you're experiencing right now. But for now, let's get back to the skies over Berlin, where the final act of this incredible drama is about to unfold. The fourth hour of the battle marked a turning point that no one had anticipated. German fighter formations, depleted by hours of intense combat and facing critical fuel shortages, began to break off individual engagements and attempt returns to their home bases. This wasn't a coordinated withdrawal, it was the inevitable result of operational limitations that made continued combat impossible regardless of tactical success or failure. American pilots, recognizing the changing character of the engagement, began to shift their tactics from defensive escort duties to aggressive pursuit of withdrawing German fighters. The superior range of the Mustang allowed American formations to maintain combat operations even as their opponents were forced to disengage, creating opportunities for devastating attacks on German aircraft at their most vulnerable moments. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound for both sides. German pilots who had begun the day expecting to achieve a decisive victory found themselves fleeing from an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited endurance and determination. American airmen realized that they had not only survived the most intensive German air attack of the war but had actually driven their opponents from the battlefield. Individual combat stories from this phase of the battle demonstrated the complete reversal of tactical momentum. A formation of Mustangs intercepted German fighters attempting to return to base, shooting down 3 aircraft before the survivors could escape into cloud cover. Another American squadron caught a group of German fighters refueling at a forward airfield, destroying several aircraft on the ground and forcing others to take off with insufficient fuel for extended operations. The bomber formations, having completed their assigned missions over Berlin, began their return journey under escort by fighters that had achieved complete air superiority over one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The symbolic importance of this achievement could not be overstated. American bombers had struck at the heart of the Reich in broad daylight and were returning home under the protection of fighters that had dominated the best the Luftwaffe could offer. German radar operators watched helplessly as the American formations departed German airspace, their own fighter forces too depleted and disorganized to mount any effective pursuit. The carefully planned defensive operation had not only failed to stop the bombing attack but had resulted in losses that would take months to replace, if replacement was even possible given Germany's increasingly desperate strategic situation. The return flight provided an opportunity for American pilots to assess the results of their unprecedented engagement. Radio communications revealed the extent of German losses while also confirming the remarkable effectiveness of American tactics and equipment. Pilots who had begun the day uncertain about their chances of survival were now realizing they had participated in one of the most decisive aerial victories in military history. Ground crews at English bases prepared for the return of formations that had achieved something previously considered impossible, the successful execution of a major daylight bombing attack on Berlin with acceptable losses and clear tactical superiority over defending forces. The implications for future operations were staggering, suggesting that nowhere in Germany was now beyond the reach of Allied strategic bombing. The human cost of the victory was significant but sustainable. American losses totaled 69 bombers and 11 fighters, heavy casualties that represented the sacrifice of over 700 airmen, but far fewer than the catastrophic losses that German commanders had hoped to inflict. More importantly, the majority of American aircraft and crews had returned safely, maintaining the operational capability of units that could repeat such attacks indefinitely. German losses were far more severe in both absolute and relative terms. Over 100 fighters had been destroyed, representing not just aircraft that were increasingly difficult to replace but experienced pilots whose loss would weaken the Luftwaffe far beyond the immediate tactical impact. These were men who had survived years of combat and possessed skills that took years to develop, skills that Germany no longer had time to replace. The strategic implications became clear as intelligence officers analyzed the results of the engagement. German air defenses, once considered virtually impenetrable, had been not just penetrated but effectively neutralized by a combination of superior technology, training, and tactical innovation. The daylight bombing campaign, previously considered prohibitively expensive in lives and resources, had been proven viable against even the most heavily defended targets. Post-mission debriefings revealed the extent to which American advantages had exceeded even optimistic pre-war projections. The P-51 Mustang had proven itself capable of not just escorting bombers to any target in Europe but of achieving and maintaining air superiority over those targets for extended periods. This capability fundamentally changed the strategic balance in Europe and opened possibilities for operations that had previously been considered impossible. The psychological impact on German morale was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated European skies with apparent effortless superiority, had been humiliated over its own capital by an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and technological advantages. The myth of German invincibility in aerial combat had been shattered so completely that recovery seemed impossible. American morale, conversely, reached new heights as news of the victory spread throughout Allied forces. The demonstration that German air defenses could be overcome with acceptable losses provided enormous encouragement for ground forces preparing for the invasion of Europe and validated the enormous investment in strategic bombing capabilities that had been questioned by many critics. The industrial targets struck during the mission suffered significant damage that would affect German war production for months to come. Aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, and transportation hubs essential to the German war effort had been hit with precision that demonstrated the effectiveness of daylight bombing when properly supported by air superiority fighters. The technological lessons learned during the engagement influenced aircraft design and pilot training for the remainder of the war. The superior performance of the P-51 Mustang validated design principles that would characterize fighter development for decades to come, while German engineers faced the sobering realization that their aircraft were no longer competitive with Allied designs. The tactical innovations developed during the battle became standard doctrine for subsequent operations. The ability of escort fighters to range far from bomber formations while maintaining effective protection revolutionized strategic bombing operations and made possible attacks that would have been suicidal under previous tactical constraints. Intelligence analysis revealed the extent to which the engagement had disrupted German air defense organization. The loss of experienced pilots and operational aircraft had created gaps in defensive coverage that would take months to fill, if replacement was possible at all given Germany's deteriorating strategic position. The battle's outcome influenced Allied strategy for the remainder of the European war. The demonstrated ability to achieve air superiority over any target in Germany opened possibilities for supporting ground operations that had been previously considered too risky to attempt. The invasion of Europe, scheduled for later in 1944, would benefit enormously from the air superiority capabilities proven in this engagement. German strategic planning was forced to confront the reality that the Reich could no longer defend itself against sustained Allied air attacks. The implications for industrial production, military morale, and civilian populations were staggering, suggesting that Germany's ability to continue the war was fundamentally compromised. The ripple effects of March 6, 1944, extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Within weeks, intelligence reports confirmed that German fighter production was being shifted from offensive to defensive aircraft, indicating a fundamental change in Luftwaffe strategy from attack to survival. Training programs were accelerated to dangerous levels in desperate attempts to replace lost pilots, resulting in inexperienced aviators being thrown into combat with minimal preparation. American bomber crews who had participated in the mission reported a dramatic change in German fighter tactics in subsequent operations. The aggressive, coordinated attacks that had characterized previous Luftwaffe operations were replaced by hit-and-run tactics that suggested a force more concerned with survival than achieving decisive results. The psychological dominance that German fighters had once enjoyed was completely reversed. The technological race that had driven aviation development throughout the war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. German engineers, faced with the demonstrated superiority of American designs, were forced to pursue increasingly desperate technological solutions that diverted resources from proven designs to experimental projects that would never reach operational status in time to influence the war's outcome. Individual pilot accounts from both sides provided insight into the human dimension of this technological and tactical revolution. American aviators who had begun their careers facing superior German aircraft in tactics now found themselves flying the most capable fighter in the world, supported by training and resources that gave them decisive advantages in any engagement. German pilots, conversely, faced the devastating realization that their technological and tactical superiority had been not just matched but exceeded by an enemy that seemed to improve with each engagement. Veterans who had survived years of combat found themselves outclassed by American pilots flying superior aircraft, a psychological burden that affected performance even beyond the mechanical disadvantages they faced. The industrial implications were equally profound. American aircraft production, already operating at unprecedented levels, received validation that its products were not just adequate but superior to anything the enemy could produce. This confirmation justified continued investment in advanced designs that would maintain American superiority for decades to come. German industry faced the opposite realization. Despite years of development and the accumulated expertise of some of the world's most talented engineers, German aircraft were no longer competitive with Allied designs. The resources required to close this gap would have demanded a complete reorganization of industrial priorities that Germany's desperate strategic situation made impossible. The training revolution that had produced American pilot superiority became a model for other air forces around the world. The combination of extensive flight training, advanced gunnery instruction, and tactical doctrine specifically designed to exploit aircraft capabilities created a template that influenced military aviation training for generations. German training programs, faced with severe shortages of fuel, experienced instructors, and operational aircraft, were forced to accept standards that virtually guaranteed inferiority in combat. The loss of experienced pilots during the Berlin engagement accelerated this decline, creating a vicious cycle that made recovery increasingly impossible. The strategic bombing campaign that had been validated by the Berlin mission expanded rapidly in scope and effectiveness. Targets that had previously been considered too heavily defended became routine objectives for American bombers operating under Mustang escort. The industrial heart of Germany became accessible to Allied attack with a regularity that made sustained production increasingly difficult. Air superiority, once considered a temporary tactical advantage, became a permanent strategic asset that influenced every aspect of military operations. Ground forces could operate with confidence that enemy air attacks would be minimal, while Allied aircraft could provide support with unprecedented effectiveness and minimal losses. The climactic moment that defined the entire engagement came during the fifth hour of combat, when the last German reserves were committed to a final desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. Fresh fighter squadrons, held back during the initial phases of the battle, were launched in a coordinated attack designed to achieve at least a propaganda victory that could offset the tactical defeat. This final German effort represented everything the Luftwaffe had learned about air combat during 5 years of war. Experienced pilots flying the most advanced aircraft available attacked with tactical sophistication that utilized every advantage that altitude, surprise, and concentration of force could provide. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that German air power might achieve the decisive success that had eluded them throughout the day. But the American response demonstrated just how completely the balance of aerial warfare had shifted. Mustang formations that had been engaged in combat for hours still possessed the performance and firepower to meet the German attack with devastating effectiveness. Fresh squadrons held in reserve were vectored to intercept points with precision that reflected superior radar coverage and communication systems. The final engagement lasted less than 30 minutes, but its intensity exceeded anything that had occurred during the previous 4 hours of combat. German pilots, knowing this was their last opportunity to achieve meaningful success, fought with desperate courage that reflected their understanding of what defeat would mean for their homeland and their air force. American pilots met this final challenge with professional competence that reflected not just superior training and equipment but confidence born of hours of successful combat against the best the enemy could offer. Their tactical responses were precise, coordinated, and devastatingly effective against opponents who were fighting more from desperation than tactical advantage. When the last German fighter broke off and headed for home, the silence that followed was deafening. The radio frequencies that had carried urgent combat communications for over 5 hours suddenly filled with routine navigation calls and status reports. The battle for Berlin was over, and everyone in the sky knew that something fundamental had changed in the European air war. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scale of what had been accomplished. German losses exceeded 160 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair, with pilot casualties that represented a significant percentage of the Luftwaffe's remaining experienced combat aviators. These were losses that Germany simply could not sustain given its declining industrial capacity and shrinking pilot training programs. American losses, while significant in absolute terms, were manageable within the context of an industrial and training system that could replace both aircraft and pilots at rates that exceeded combat attrition. The 80 aircraft lost during the mission represented less than a single day's production from American factories, while replacement crews were already in training at facilities across the United States. The strategic implications became clear within days as intelligence reports confirmed the extent of German disorganization following the engagement. Fighter squadrons that had been decimated during the battle were withdrawn from operational status, creating gaps in air defense coverage that would persist for months. American commanders realized they had achieved something unprecedented in military aviation: the complete neutralization of enemy air defenses over a major strategic target through tactical superiority rather than overwhelming numerical advantage. This capability opened operational possibilities that had been previously considered impossible. The technological validation provided by the mission's success influenced Allied aircraft development for the remainder of the war and beyond. The P-51 Mustang became the template for long-range escort fighters, while its tactical employment established doctrines that would govern air superiority operations for decades. German aviation engineering faced the sobering conclusion that their most advanced designs were inadequate against Allied aircraft that combined superior performance with tactical employment that maximized their advantages. The resources required to develop competitive aircraft were no longer available given Germany's desperate strategic situation. The human stories that emerged from the battle provided insight into the personal dimension of this technological and tactical revolution. American pilots who had survived the mission carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of the most decisive military engagements of the modern era. German survivors faced the psychological burden of having witnessed the destruction of an air force that had once dominated European skies. The realization that German technical and tactical superiority was not just challenged but decisively defeated had profound implications for morale throughout the remaining German military forces. The industrial workers who had built both American and German aircraft could see in the battle's outcome the validation or failure of their efforts. American factories received confirmation that their products were not just adequate but superior, while German industry faced the reality that years of development had produced aircraft that were no longer competitive. Training establishments on both sides absorbed lessons that would influence military aviation education for generations. The American system that had produced pilot superiority became a model for other air forces, while German programs faced the necessity of complete reorganization that time and resources no longer permitted. The strategic bombing campaign that had been validated by the Berlin mission expanded to include targets throughout Germany that had previously been considered too heavily defended for daylight attack. The industrial capacity that sustained German military operations became systematically accessible to Allied air power. The air superiority achieved during the mission became a permanent factor in European military operations. Ground forces could operate with confidence that enemy air interference would be minimal, while Allied aircraft could provide support with unprecedented effectiveness and sustainable losses. Now, as we reach the conclusion of this incredible story, I want you to think about what we've just witnessed together. This wasn't just a military engagement, this was the moment when the course of World War II was fundamentally altered by the courage of a few hundred airmen and the superiority of a single aircraft design that changed everything. The final tally of March 6, 1944, told a story that even the most optimistic Allied planners had not dared to imagine. When the last American aircraft touched down on English runways that evening, the statistics were staggering. The Luftwaffe had lost 160 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair, along with over 100 experienced pilots killed or captured. These weren't just numbers on a casualty report, they represented the irreplaceable core of German air defense capability. More devastating than the immediate losses was what intelligence officers discovered in the weeks following the battle. German fighter pilot training programs, already stretched beyond sustainability, began graduating pilots with barely 50 hours of flight time, men who were essentially sacrificial offerings thrown into combat against American pilots with 10 times their experience flying superior aircraft. The psychological impact spread throughout the German military hierarchy like a virus. General Adolf Galland, the head of German fighter forces, reportedly told his staff that the Luftwaffe had been broken in spirit by the Berlin engagement. When the best your air force can offer is systematically destroyed by enemy fighters operating hundreds of miles from their home bases, the implications for national defense become impossible to ignore. But the human cost extended far beyond statistics and strategic analysis. In small towns across Germany, families received the devastating news that sons and fathers who had once been celebrated as the masters of European skies were now missing or dead over their own capital. The propaganda machine that had promoted the invincibility of German air power found itself struggling to explain how American bombers could strike Berlin in daylight and return home under the protection of fighters that dominated every engagement. American families received different news, letters and telegrams confirming that their men had participated in one of the most decisive military victories of the war. But even victory came with its price. The 700 American airmen who didn't return home that day represented the human cost of achieving something that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The ripple effects of that single day's combat continued to spread throughout 1944 and beyond. Within 6 weeks of the Berlin mission, American bombers were striking targets throughout Germany with a regularity that made sustained industrial production increasingly difficult. The ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, and synthetic fuel facilities that sustained the German war effort became routine objectives for bombing campaigns that operated with impunity under Mustang escort. German civilians, who had been promised that the homeland would never be successfully attacked, found themselves living under the constant threat of air raids that their own air force could no longer prevent. The psychological impact on civilian morale was devastating, contributing to a general collapse of confidence in German military capabilities that influenced every aspect of the war effort. The technological lessons learned during the engagement influenced aircraft design for decades after the war ended. The P-51 Mustangs' combination of range, speed, and firepower became the template for fighter aircraft development throughout the Cold War era. Soviet, British, and American engineers all studied the factors that had made the Mustang so devastatingly effective, incorporating those lessons into designs that would dominate military aviation for generations. German engineering faced a different reality. The aircraft that had once been considered the most advanced in the world were suddenly obsolete, outclassed by American designs that combined superior performance with tactical employment that maximized their advantages. The jet aircraft programs that Germany pioneered might have restored some technological balance, but the resources and time required for their development were luxuries that Germany's desperate strategic situation no longer permitted. The training revolution that had produced American air superiority became a permanent feature of military aviation education. The comprehensive programs that combined extensive flight training with advanced gunnery instruction and tactical doctrine specifically designed to exploit aircraft capabilities created pilots who were not just competent but superior in every measurable category. Individual stories from the battle continued to emerge for decades after the war ended. American pilots who had survived the engagement carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of the most significant military victories in aviation history. Their personal accounts, published in memoirs and interviews, provided insight into the human dimension of technological and tactical superiority. German survivors faced a different psychological burden. Veterans who had once dominated European skies found themselves witnesses to the complete destruction of an air force that had once seemed invincible. Their accounts, when they were willing to share them, revealed the devastating impact of fighting an enemy that possessed not just superior equipment but operational systems that made effective resistance virtually impossible. The strategic bombing campaign that had been validated by the Berlin mission achieved results that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war projections. German industrial production, which had continued to increase despite previous bombing campaigns, began to decline as sustained attacks made normal operations impossible. Transportation systems that had previously been considered too well defended for effective attack became routine targets for bombing campaigns that operated with minimal losses under fighter escort that could dominate any defensive response. The industrial infrastructure that supported German military operations became systematically accessible to Allied air power. The air superiority achieved during March 6, 1944, became a permanent factor in all subsequent European military operations. The D-Day invasion, launched 3 months later, benefited enormously from the knowledge that German air interference would be minimal and that Allied air support could be provided with unprecedented effectiveness. Ground forces operating under American air cover gained confidence that translated into tactical aggressiveness and operational success that might not have been possible under different circumstances. The psychological advantage of knowing that the skies belonged to friendly forces influenced every aspect of combat operations. As we reflect on this incredible story, it's important to understand that what happened over Berlin on March 6, 1944, was more than just a military engagement. It was the moment when American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and pilot training combined to achieve something that changed the fundamental nature of aerial warfare. The P-51 Mustang didn't just win a battle, it proved that properly designed, adequately supported, and professionally employed military technology could achieve decisive results that influenced the entire course of a global conflict. The men who flew those aircraft didn't just complete a mission, they demonstrated that training, courage, and superior equipment could overcome even the most desperate defensive efforts. But perhaps most importantly, this story demonstrates how individual acts of courage, when properly supported by national resources and technological capability, can achieve results that influence the course of history. The pilots who flew into that death trap over Berlin changed the world through their willingness to risk everything for a cause they believed in. So here's my question for you, and I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. After hearing this incredible story of technological innovation, tactical brilliance, and individual courage, what do you think was the most important factor in achieving this decisive victory? Was it the superior performance of the P-51 Mustang? The advanced training of American pilots? The industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than they occurred? Or was it something else entirely, the intangible factor of men willing to fly into impossible odds because they believed their cause was worth any sacrifice? Whatever your answer, make sure you let me know in the comments, because I read every single one and your insights help shape the stories we tell in future videos. And speaking of future videos, if you want to hear more incredible stories like this one, tales of impossible odds, technological breakthroughs, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got an entire library of the most insane military history you've never heard, stories that will blow your mind and give you a completely new perspective on how the modern world came to exist. From the secret weapons that almost changed everything to the individual acts of heroism that literally altered the course of human events, we're committed to bringing you the most incredible true stories ever told. And here's the thing, every subscription, every like, every comment helps us continue to research and produce these incredibly detailed stories. The level of historical accuracy and dramatic storytelling you just experienced takes enormous amounts of time and effort to create, and your support makes it possible for us to keep bringing you content that you literally cannot find anywhere else. So do me that favor, hit subscribe, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who appreciates incredible stories of human achievement under impossible circumstances. Because the story of March 6, 1944, isn't just about airplanes and tactics, it's about what becomes possible when human courage meets superior technology in service of a cause worth fighting for. The men who flew that mission over Berlin didn't know they were making history. They just knew they had a job to do, and they were willing to risk everything to do it right. Their legacy is the world we live in today, a world where freedom and democracy survived their greatest test because a few hundred pilots were willing to fly straight into hell and fight their way back out. That's the kind of story we tell here, and if you want more of them, you know what to do. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another incredible moment when ordinary people did extraordinary things and changed the world forever.
Picture this. It's December 1944, deep in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest. American GIs are huddled in their foxholes, watching in absolute terror as German Panther tanks roll through their lines like they're made of paper. These monsters weigh 45 tons, their sloped armor deflecting every single round the Americans can throw at them. Shell after shell sparks harmlessly off their steel hides while they methodically hunt down Allied tanks one by one. The 75mm guns on American Shermans might as well be spitballs. It's a massacre, and the Germans know it. They're laughing on their radio nets, calling American tanks Tommy Cookers and Ronson lighters because they catch fire so easily. But then, through the swirling snow and smoke, something new appears on the battlefield. It's low, angular, and carries a gun barrel so impossibly long it looks like a telephone pole mounted on tracks. The German tank commander squints through his periscope, frantically flipping through his recognition manual. This thing isn't in there. He's never seen anything like it. The breech closes with a metallic clang. A voice shouts, "Fire!" The ground shakes. And suddenly, that supposedly invincible panther explodes in a fireball so violent it lights up the entire forest. The turret, all 15 tons of it, goes cartwheeling through the air like a beer can. In that moment, everything changed. The hunters had just become the hunted. Before you go anywhere, I need you to do me a massive favor. This is the kind of forgotten history that YouTube's algorithm absolutely loves to bury, so if you want to see more incredible stories like this one, smash that subscribe button right now. Seriously, do it before you forget, because what I'm about to tell you about America's secret weapon is going to blow your mind. And you definitely don't want to miss what's coming next in this series. What you just witnessed was the combat debut of the most feared tank destroyer in American history. A machine so effective that German commanders started having nightmares about its distinctive silhouette. They called it the long gun in their panicked radio transmissions, but American crews had a different name for it, the M36 Jackson. And the story of how this absolute monster came to exist is even more incredible than its battlefield performance. This wasn't just another tank rolling off an assembly line. This was a weapon born from pure desperation, designed by engineers who were literally racing against time as American boys were dying in their burning Shermans thousands of miles away. The 90mm gun mounted on this beast was so powerful it could punch through 9 inches of solid steel armor at over 1,000 yards. To put that in perspective, that's enough firepower to go straight through the front plate of a Tiger tank and out the other side, taking half the crew with it. But here's the thing that's going to shock you. This game-changing weapon almost never existed at all. In fact, there were generals in the Pentagon who wanted to cancel the entire project just months before D-Day. They thought it was too little, too late. Thank God they were wrong, because without the M36 Jackson, the Battle of the Bulge might have had a very different ending. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. We're talking about a weapon that showed up so late in the war that most German tank crews had never even seen one before it killed them. Imagine being in a Tiger tank, feeling completely invincible because no Allied gun has ever threatened you. And then suddenly this mystery machine appears out of nowhere and vaporizes your buddy's Panther with a single shot. That's psychological warfare at its finest. The story begins in the summer of 1943. In a nondescript office building in Detroit where American engineers were poring over intelligence reports that made their blood run cold. The Germans had done the impossible. They'd built tanks that were essentially immune to every weapon in the American arsenal. The new Panther tanks rolling off German production lines had frontal armor that was 5 inches thick and sloped at such an angle that American shells would literally bounce off like ping-pong balls. Even worse, they were fast, reliable, and equipped with high-velocity 75mm guns that could kill a Sherman from over 2 miles away. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Except the other guy had a machine gun and you had a butter knife. The situation was so desperate that American tank crews in Italy were welding extra steel plates onto their Shermans, not because it would actually stop a German shell, but because it made them feel slightly less like they were driving around in a death trap. Morale was in the toilet. Experienced tank commanders were requesting transfers to the infantry, and that should tell you everything you need to know about how bad things had gotten. The infantry! These were guys who'd rather face German machine guns on foot than climb into another Sherman and go up against a Panther. But while American tankers were getting slaughtered in Europe, back in the States, a small group of brilliant engineers were working on something that would change everything. They'd been studying captured German guns, analyzing every piece of intelligence they could get their hands on, and they'd come to a shocking conclusion. The answer to America's tank problem wasn't in the motor pool. It was in the sky. The U.S. military had developed an incredible 90mm anti-aircraft gun for shooting down German bombers. This thing was a monster, designed to hurl 40-pound shells at aircraft flying at 30,000 feet and moving at 300 miles per hour. The muzzle velocity was absolutely insane, almost 3,000 feet per second, which meant its shells hit like the fist of an angry god. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some genius engineer, whose name has been lost to history but who deserves a statue in his honor, looked at this massive anti-aircraft gun and had a crazy idea. What if instead of shooting at planes, they pointed it at German tanks? The math was simple but devastating. A shell moving at 3,000 feet per second doesn't care how thick your armor is. Physics is physics, and kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity. In other words, this thing wouldn't just penetrate German armor. It would absolutely obliterate it. The problem was getting this monster onto the battlefield. The anti-aircraft version weighed over 7 tons and required a massive crew to operate. It was about as mobile as a concrete bunker, which made it completely useless for tank warfare, where mobility meant survival. They needed to somehow shrink this cannon down and mount it on something that could keep up with fast-moving armored battles. The solution came from another stroke of genius. Instead of starting from scratch, they'd modify an existing platform. The M10 tank destroyer had been doing decent work against older German tanks, but its 3-inch gun was pathetically inadequate against the new Panthers and Tigers. However, its hull was solid, reliable, and most importantly, it was already in production. The engineers realized they could strip off the M10's turret and replace it with something bigger, something that could handle the massive 90mm cannon. It was like taking the engine out of a sports car and dropping in a rocket motor. Theoretically possible, but practically insane. The project was given the highest priority classification, and teams of engineers worked around the clock to make it happen. They had to completely redesign the turret to accommodate the huge gun. The new turret was bigger, heavier, and required a massive counterweight in the back to keep the whole thing from tipping over when the gun was aimed forward. They called this counterweight section the bustle, and it stuck out behind the turret like the tail of some prehistoric beast. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. But here's where the story gets even more desperate. By early 1944, the situation in Europe had become critical. The Germans had started mass-producing Panthers, and American casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. Every day the M36 project was delayed meant more American boys coming home in body bags. The pressure was so intense that the engineers were literally sleeping in their offices, working 18-hour days to get prototypes ready for testing. The first test firing was scheduled for March 1944 at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Picture this scene. A group of Army officers, engineers, and brass from Washington all standing behind a protective barrier, watching as the first M36 prototype rolled into position. The target was a captured German Panther tank, positioned 1,000 yards downrange. This was the moment of truth. Either this crazy idea would work, or they'd wasted months of precious time and resources on an elaborate failure. The gunner lined up his shot. The breech closed with a metallic slam that echoed across the proving ground. And then came the moment that changed everything. The 90mm gun roared like the voice of Thor himself, and the Panther simply ceased to exist. The armor-piercing shell hit the front plate and went through it like it was made of cheese. The rear plate bulged outward and then ruptured, sending chunks of steel flying hundreds of yards. The interior of the tank was completely destroyed, every piece of equipment turned into twisted scrap metal. There was dead silence for about 5 seconds, and then someone started cheering. Within minutes, the entire proving ground was in celebration mode. They'd done it. They'd created a weapon that could not just threaten German heavy tanks, but absolutely devastate them. The test was repeated with different ammunition types at different ranges against different targets. The results were consistent. The M36 Jackson was a tank killer without equal. Production was approved immediately, and by summer 1944, the first M36s were rolling off assembly lines in Detroit. But getting them to the battlefield was another challenge entirely. The Normandy invasion had already happened, and every available ship was being used to ferry men and supplies to the beachhead. Tank destroyers weren't considered a priority compared to regular Sherman tanks and artillery pieces. It was frustrating beyond belief for the crews who had trained on these machines and knew what they could do. The first M36s finally arrived in France in August 1944, just in time for the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. The crews who received them were amazed by what they were seeing. After months of feeling helpless against German armor, they suddenly had a weapon that looked like it could take on the world. The gun barrel was so long it had to be supported by a travel lock when moving, and the whole machine had an aura of barely contained violence that was impossible to ignore. But combat would prove that the M36, while incredibly powerful, was far from perfect. The open-topped turret that had been necessary to save weight and improve visibility turned out to be a nightmare in the field. Rain would pour directly onto the crew, making operation miserable during the wet European autumn. Worse, the open top made them vulnerable to artillery fragments and even rifle fire from elevated positions. Crews quickly learned to improvise, welding steel plates over their heads or rigging canvas covers to keep out the elements. The real problem, though, was ammunition. The special high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that made the M36 so deadly were incredibly scarce. Each shell cost more to manufacture than some entire weapon systems, and the complex production process meant supplies were always running short. Most M36 crews were issued only a handful of these silver bullets and were ordered to save them for the most dangerous targets. The regular armor-piercing shells were effective against medium tanks but struggled with the heaviest German armor. The first major test came during the pursuit across France in late summer 1944. German Panther tanks were conducting a fighting withdrawal, setting up ambush positions and then falling back when the pressure got too intense. It was exactly the kind of warfare the M36 had been designed for. The long gun gave American crews the ability to engage at extended range, picking off Panthers from positions where the Germans couldn't effectively fight back. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien, commanding an M36 from the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, described his first kill in a letter home. "We were moving through this little French village when our lead Sherman suddenly exploded. There was a Panther hull down behind a stone wall about 800 yards out, just waiting for us to drive into his kill zone. In the old days, we would have had to call for artillery or air support, and by the time help arrived, that Panther would have been long gone. But now we had the long gun. I told my gunner to put one of our special rounds right through his front plate, and that's exactly what happened. The Panther literally came apart at the seams. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." Stories like this spread quickly through the American forces in Europe. The M36 crews were becoming legends, and German intelligence was starting to take notice. Captured documents from this period show that German commanders were desperately trying to figure out what this new American weapon was. They knew it existed because their tank crews were reporting long-range kills from guns that shouldn't have been able to penetrate Panther armor, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. The mystery deepened because M36 production numbers were relatively small. Unlike the thousands of Sherman tanks rolling around Europe, there were only a few hundred Jacksons in the entire theater. They appeared suddenly, killed a few German tanks, and then disappeared before anyone could get a good look at them. German tank crews started referring to them as ghost guns because they seemed to materialize out of nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and then vanish. This psychological impact was almost as important as the physical destruction the M36 could cause. German Panther and Tiger crews had become accustomed to being the apex predators on the battlefield. They moved with confidence, knowing that no Allied weapon could seriously threaten them at long range. The M36 shattered that confidence completely. Suddenly, every engagement was potentially lethal. That distinctive long gun silhouette became a symbol of death to German armored forces. But the real test was still to come. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched his last major offensive of the war, sending the cream of Germany's remaining armored forces through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was the largest concentration of German armor. Since the early days of the war, including dozens of Tiger and Panther tanks, plus the dreaded King Tiger, a 70-ton monster with armor so thick it was virtually immune to most Allied weapons. The initial German assault was devastating. Entire American units were overrun or surrounded, and it looked like the enemy might actually succeed in splitting the Allied forces and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. In this desperate situation, every available M36 was rushed to the front lines. Tank destroyer battalions were broken up, and their Jacksons distributed to wherever they were needed most. It was a make-or-break moment for the entire program. At the town of St. Vith, a critical road junction that the Germans absolutely had to capture, elements of the 7th Armored Division had set up a defensive perimeter. Among their forces were 6 M36 tank destroyers positioned in carefully chosen ambush sites with clear fields of fire. The crews had spent hours studying the terrain, plotting range cards, and preparing for the assault they knew was coming. The German attack began before dawn on December 17th, with Panther tanks leading the advance. The morning fog was so thick that visibility was limited to just a few hundred yards, which should have favored the attacking Germans. But the M-36 crews had done their homework. They knew exactly where the enemy would appear and had their guns trained on those positions. Corporal Danny Martinez was the gunner on one of these M-36s when the first Panther emerged from the fog. It was like a scene from a horror movie, he later recalled. This massive shape just materialized out of nowhere, moving fast and heading straight for our position. I could see the muzzle flash from its gun as it fired at something to our left. My commander whispered, "Target identified, Panther tank, 800 yards, fire when ready." I lined up the shot, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The gun went off like a lightning bolt, and through the smoke, I could see that Panther just disintegrate. The turret went flying one way, the hull went the other, and there was this massive fireball that lit up the whole battlefield. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. That single shot was heard across the entire perimeter, and it had an immediate effect on both sides. The American defenders suddenly realized they had a weapon that could actually hurt the German heavy tanks, while the German attack began to falter as crews became aware that their supposedly invulnerable Panthers were being destroyed by an unknown weapon. The psychological impact was enormous. Throughout that first day of the battle, M-36 hits across the front lines were making their presence felt. At Manhay, an M-36 crew led by Sergeant First Class Robert "Tank" Thompson engaged a King Tiger at point-blank range. The King Tiger's frontal armor was too thick for even the 90mm gun to penetrate reliably, but Thompson ordered his driver to maneuver around the massive German tank until they had a clear shot at its side. The resulting battle was like something out of a medieval joust, with both tanks circling each other, looking for the perfect shot. Finally, Thompson's gunner found his opening and put a round through the King Tiger's side armor. The explosion was so violent that it shook buildings half a mile away. But it wasn't just the firepower that made the M-36 effective. It was the courage and skill of its crews. These men knew they were operating a weapon with thin armor that couldn't take a hit from the monsters they were fighting. Their survival depended on striking first and striking hard. There was no room for error, no second chances. Every engagement was do or die, and that pressure created some of the finest tank killers in military history. Now, before I continue with the most incredible part of this story, I need to ask for your help. The algorithm is brutal to channels that cover military history, and the only way we can keep bringing you these amazing forgotten stories is if you help us out. So if you're enjoying this deep dive into the M-36, Jackson, do me a huge favor and hit that like button right now. It literally takes 2 seconds, but it makes a massive difference in whether YouTube shows this video to other history lovers. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know what you think about the Jackson so far. Do you think it was the best tank destroyer of the war, or is there another vehicle that deserves that title? The Battle of the Bulge raged for over a month, and throughout that desperate struggle, M-36 crews were writing their names in the history books. At the town of Manhay, a single M-36, commanded by Staff Sergeant Anthony Pinto, achieved what many consider the longest-range tank kill of the entire war. Pinto spotted a Panther tank positioned on a ridge line over 4,000 yards away, barely visible even through his powerful telescopic sight. At that range, most tank crews wouldn't even attempt a shot. The margin for error was microscopic, and even a slight miscalculation in range or wind speed would send the shell harmlessly into the dirt. But Pinto had been studying that particular Panther for hours, watching its movement patterns and calculating the precise firing solution. He ordered his gunner to load one of their precious high-velocity rounds, the kind they were supposed to save for emergencies. This qualified. The shot had to travel for over 6 seconds before it reached the target, and in that time, the German tank could have moved completely out of the line of fire. Pinto held his breath as his gunner made the final adjustments and squeezed the trigger. The shell arced through the cold December air in a perfect ballistic curve, and Pinto watched through his binoculars as it struck the distant Panther with pinpoint accuracy. Even at that incredible range, the 90mm round punched through the German tank's side armor like it was paper. The Panther exploded in a fireball so bright it was visible from miles away. German radio intercepts later revealed that the crew of that tank had been convinced they were completely safe at such an extreme range. They never saw it coming. But the M-36's finest hour came during the defense of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded and desperately holding on against overwhelming German forces. The paratroopers had no heavy anti-tank weapons and were being systematically destroyed by German armor. A small group of M-36s from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion managed to fight their way into the encircled town just hours before the German ring closed completely. These 6 tank destroyers became the backbone of Bastogne's anti-tank defense. Positioned in carefully camouflaged positions around the town's perimeter, they waited as German forces mounted attack after attack. The crews were operating under impossible conditions, with limited ammunition, no hope of resupply, and surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. But they held their ground, and over the next week, they destroyed over 30 German tanks and assault guns. The most famous engagement occurred on Christmas Day, 1944, when a massive German assault spearheaded by Tiger tanks broke through the American perimeter. The situation was desperate, with German infantry fighting house to house in the streets of Bastogne. An M-36, commanded by Lieutenant William Wild Bill Henderson, was positioned in the town square when a Tiger tank rounded the corner just 200 yards away. At that range, both tanks were in each other's kill zone, but the Tiger's massive gun could obliterate the M-36 with a single hit, while the Jackson would need to hit a vital spot to stop the German monster. It came down to who could fire first. Henderson's gunner had been tracking the Tiger's movement and already had the gun laid on target. The Tiger's crew, surprised by the American tank destroyer's position, needed precious seconds to traverse their gun. Those seconds made all the difference. The M-36's 90mm gun roared, and the armor-piercing shell hit the Tiger squarely in the front plate. The impact was so violent that the Tiger's gun barrel was knocked completely off axis and smoke began pouring from its hatches. The crew bailed out and ran for cover as their tank burned. Henderson's quick thinking and his gunner's skill had saved not just their own lives but potentially the entire defense of Bastogne. When the siege was finally broken and relief forces fought their way into Bastogne, they found the 6 M-36s still in action, though all of them showed signs of heavy combat. Their armor was pocked with bullet holes and shell fragments. Their paint was burned off in places, and their crews looked like they'd aged 10 years in a week. But they had held their ground and proven that the M-36 Jackson was more than just a powerful gun. It was a war winner. The performance of M-36 units during the Battle of the Bulge was so impressive that German intelligence launched a crash program to identify and counter this new American weapon. Captured documents show that by January 1945, German tank crews were being briefed specifically on the long gun threat and given instructions on how to identify and engage M-36 tank destroyers. The problem was that by then it was too late. American production was hitting full stride and more Jacksons were arriving in Europe every week. But perhaps the most telling sign of the M-36's impact was how German tactics began to change. Panther and Tiger crews, who had previously moved with confidence across the battlefield, now advanced cautiously, constantly scanning for the distinctive silhouette of the Jackson's long gun. German armored attacks became more hesitant, less aggressive, as crews worried about being picked off by an unseen M-36 at extreme range. The psychological advantage had completely shifted. As the war entered its final phase and Allied forces crossed the Rhine into Germany itself, the M-36 continued to prove its worth. German resistance was fanatical, and every town and city was defended by whatever armor the Wehrmacht could scrape together. This included not just the standard Panthers and Tigers, but also experimental heavy tanks like the Jagdtiger, a monster mounting a 128mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at absurd ranges. The Jagdtiger was supposed to be the ultimate tank killer, but it met its match in the M-36. At the town of Remagen, where American forces had captured a vital bridge across the Rhine, a single Jagdtiger had positioned itself to cover the crossing. Its massive gun commanded the entire bridge, and German commanders were confident that no Allied tank could get close enough to threaten it. They were wrong. An M-36 crew from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, led by Sergeant Iron Mike Kowalski, spotted the Jag Tiger from over 2 miles away. Using the superior optics and fire control systems on their tank destroyer, they managed to work their way into a position where they could engage the German monster from its blind side. The resulting duel lasted over an hour, with both tanks maneuvering for position while exchanging long-range fire. Finally, Kowalski's gunner managed to put a round through a weak spot in the Jag Tiger's side armor, penetrating into the crew compartment and causing a devastating ammunition explosion. The Jag Tiger, which was supposed to be invulnerable to any Allied gun, was completely destroyed. More importantly, the bridge at Remagen remained open, allowing thousands of Allied troops and vehicles to pour into Germany and hasten the end of the war. As German resistance collapsed in the spring of 1945, M-36 crews found themselves engaging increasingly desperate and poorly equipped opponents. Many German tanks were being crewed by hastily trained boys or old men, and mechanical breakdowns were becoming more common than combat losses. The Jackson had gone from being a desperately needed answer to German super tanks to being almost overpowered for the threats it was facing. The end of the European war in May 1945 should have marked the end of the M-36's combat career, but the Pacific theater still beckoned. Plans were drawn up to ship hundreds of Jacksons to the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. The 90mm gun would have been devastating against Japanese fortifications, and the mobility of the M-36 would have been perfect for island warfare. However, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before these plans could be implemented. In total, the M-36 Jackson served in combat for less than a year, from August 1944 to May 1945, but in that brief period, it had completely changed the balance of armored warfare on the Western Front. German tank crews who had once felt invincible were reduced to nervous wrecks, constantly looking over their shoulders for the distinctive silhouette of the long gun. Allied forces who had spent years feeling outgunned and outmatched finally had a weapon that could go toe-to-toe with the best the enemy could field. But here's what makes the M-36's story even more remarkable. This was just the beginning. While most World War II weapons were quickly retired and forgotten after 1945, the Jackson went on to have one of the longest and most varied service careers of any armored vehicle in history. The story of what happened next is absolutely mind-blowing. The post-war years saw massive changes in military technology and strategy, and many experts predicted that the era of tank destroyers was over. The new M26 Pershing tank mounted the same 90mm gun as the Jackson, but had much heavier armor and better protection for its crew. Why build specialized tank destroyers when you could have tanks that could do the same job and more? It seemed logical, and the U.S. military began retiring its M36s and scrapping them by the hundreds. But other nations saw the value in the Jackson's combination of firepower and mobility. France, still rebuilding its military after the devastation of World War II, purchased dozens of surplus M36s and modified them for their own use. French engineers upgraded the fire control systems, improved the armor protection, and even experimented with different ammunition types. These French M36s would go on to see combat in Indochina, where their ability to destroy fortified positions made them invaluable in jungle warfare. Belgium also acquired a significant number of M36s, using them as the backbone of their post-war armored forces. Belgian crews loved the Jackson's reliability and firepower, and they kept their vehicles in service well into the 1950s. Some Belgian M36s were even deployed to the Congo during that country's independence crisis, where they proved effective in urban combat situations. But the most extensive post-war use of the M36 came in South Korea, where hundreds of Jacksons were supplied as part of American military aid programs. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, these M36s were among the first American weapons to see action. The North Koreans were equipped primarily with Soviet-built T-34 tanks, the same vehicles that had terrorized German forces on the Eastern Front during World War II. The T-34 was a formidable opponent, with thick armor and a powerful gun, but it was no match for the M36's 90mm cannon. Korean War veterans described Jackson crews achieving kill ratios that bordered on the ridiculous, with single M36s destroying entire columns of T-34s in matter of minutes. The psychological impact on North Korean tank crews was similar to what German Panther crews had experienced during the Battle of the Bulge. Suddenly, their supposedly invulnerable tanks were being destroyed by an enemy weapon they didn't fully understand. Staff Sergeant Jim Morrison, who served with the 78th Tank Destroyer Battalion in Korea, described one engagement. "We were defending this hill position when about 12 T-34s came rolling up the valley in a column formation. They probably figured they could just bulldoze through our positions like they'd been doing to the South Korean units. Big mistake. We had 4 M36s positioned in hull-down positions with overlapping fields of fire. When those T-34s hit our kill zone, it was like a shooting gallery. We destroyed all 12 tanks in about 3 minutes without taking a single casualty. The North Koreans never tried that again." The success of M36s in Korea led to a renewed interest in the vehicle, and American factories briefly resumed production of spare parts and ammunition. Several M36s were even recalled from storage and refurbished for Korean service. It was an unusual situation. A weapon that had been declared obsolete was suddenly back in demand because it was so effective against the specific threats it faced. But perhaps the most surprising chapter in the M36's career came decades later in the 1990s, during the Yugoslav Wars. As the former Yugoslavia broke apart in a series of bloody conflicts, various factions desperately searched for any heavy weapons they could find. Several M36 Jacksons, some of which had been sitting in museums or serving as monuments, were pressed back into active service. These ancient tank destroyers, designed to fight German Panthers in 1944, found themselves engaging modern Yugoslav tanks and armored personnel carriers in urban combat. Incredibly, they proved to be quite effective. The 90mm gun was still powerful enough to destroy most targets it encountered, and the Jackson's mobility allowed it to operate in the confined spaces of city streets. Video footage from the siege of Sarajevo actually shows M36s in action, their distinctive long guns belching smoke as they engaged enemy positions. The sight of these World War II veterans fighting in a 1990s conflict was surreal, but it demonstrated the fundamental soundness of the M36's design. A weapon that had been cutting-edge technology in 1944 was still viable nearly 50 years later, which says something remarkable about the vision and skill of the engineers who created it. During its decades of service, the M36 underwent numerous modifications and upgrades. Some vehicles received new engines for better reliability. Others got improved fire control systems with laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. A few experimental models were fitted with reactive armor to defend against modern anti-tank weapons. Each upgrade extended the Jackson's service life and proved that its basic design was solid enough to accommodate new technology. The Israeli military also operated a small number of M36s. During their early conflicts with Arab nations, Israeli crews appreciated the Jackson's hitting power, which was particularly valuable when engaging heavily fortified positions. Some Israeli M36s were modified with additional armor and upgraded communications equipment, allowing them to serve alongside much more modern vehicles. By the time the last M36s were finally retired from active service in the early 2000s, they had participated in conflicts spanning 6 decades, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the jungles of Southeast Asia, from the mountains of Korea to the streets of Sarajevo. The Jackson had proven its worth time and again. Few military vehicles can claim such an extensive and varied combat record. Today, surviving M36 Jacksons are prized museum pieces, their long guns pointing skyward in silent tribute to the crews who operated them and the engineers who designed them. Walking around one of these vehicles, you're struck by how purposeful every aspect of its design appears. This wasn't a machine built for show. It was built to kill, and it shows. The massive gun dominates everything else, supported by a turret and hull that exist solely to get that weapon to where it needs to be. But beyond its technical specifications and combat record, The M36 Jackson represents something important about American innovation and determination. This was a weapon that shouldn't have worked. The idea of mounting a massive anti-aircraft gun on a medium tank destroyer chassis was crazy enough that most engineers would have dismissed it out of hand. The timeline was impossible, with production schedules that demanded the vehicle be ready for combat just months after the first prototypes were tested. And yet, it worked. Not only did it work, but it exceeded every expectation and became one of the most effective tank killers of the entire war. It's a testament to what can be accomplished when brilliant people are given clear objectives, adequate resources, and the freedom to think outside the box. The engineers who created the M36 weren't bound by conventional wisdom or traditional approaches. They looked at a problem, found an innovative solution, and made it work under impossible circumstances. The story of the M36 Jackson is also a story about the men who operated these machines. Tank destroyer crews were volunteers, men who had specifically chosen one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. They knew they would be facing the best tanks the enemy could field, using vehicles that prioritized firepower over protection. Every mission was potentially a suicide run, and every successful engagement was a testament to their skill, courage, and determination. These crews developed a unique culture and identity within the American military. They saw themselves as hunters, specialists whose job was to seek out and destroy enemy armor. Their unofficial motto was "Seek, Strike, and Destroy," and they lived up to it every day. Tank destroyer units had some of the highest casualty rates in the entire Army, but they also had some of the most impressive kill ratios. They were the elite, the tip of the spear. The men who went looking for trouble instead of waiting for it to find them. The psychological profile of a tank destroyer crew member was different from that of a regular tank crew or infantry soldier. These men had to be aggressive enough to actively seek out enemy tanks, but also patient enough to wait for the perfect shot. They had to be confident in their abilities, while remaining humble enough to recognize that one mistake would likely be their last. It was a difficult balance, and not everyone could handle it. Training for M36 crews was intensive and realistic. They practiced engaging targets at extreme ranges, learning to calculate firing solutions quickly and accurately. They studied German tank recognition until they could identify specific vehicle types from miles away. They learned to work together as a seamless team, with each crew member knowing exactly what the others would do in any given situation. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to think like hunters. Successful tank destroyer crews didn't just react to threats, they anticipated them. They studied enemy movement patterns, identified likely ambush sites, and positioned themselves to take advantage of terrain and visibility conditions. The best crews could read a battlefield like a book, knowing instinctively where enemy tanks would appear and how they would move. This hunting mentality extended beyond individual crews to entire tank destroyer battalions. These units operated more like wolf packs than traditional military formations. They would spread out across a wide area, communicate constantly about enemy movements, and coordinate their attacks to maximize damage while minimizing their own exposure. When a German armored column was spotted, multiple M36s would converge on the target area, setting up crossfire patterns that made escape virtually impossible. The tactical doctrine developed around the M36 was revolutionary for its time. Previous tank destroyer tactics had emphasized static defense, with vehicles positioned in prepared positions to await enemy attacks. The Jackson's mobility and firepower allowed for much more aggressive tactics. M36 units would actively patrol forward areas, seeking out enemy armor and engaging it at maximum range before withdrawing to new positions. This hit-and-run style of warfare was perfectly suited to the Jackson's strengths and limitations. The vehicle's thin armor made it vulnerable in sustained firefights, but its powerful gun and good mobility allowed it to strike quickly and escape before the enemy could respond effectively. It was guerrilla warfare with 70-ton machines, and it drove German commanders absolutely crazy. German intelligence reports from late 1944 show increasing frustration with these American tank destroyer tactics. Traditional counter-battery techniques didn't work because the M36s never stayed in one place long enough to be targeted. German tank crews found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when or where the next attack would come from. The psychological effect was devastating, turning confident veteran crews into nervous wrecks who jumped at every shadow. The M-36's impact on German morale can't be overstated. For years, German tank crews had enjoyed technological superiority on the battlefield. Their Panthers and Tigers were virtually invulnerable to most Allied weapons, which gave them enormous confidence and aggressive tactics. The appearance of the Jackson shattered that confidence overnight. Suddenly, every engagement was potentially lethal, and that knowledge affected every aspect of German armored operations. German tank crews began adopting increasingly defensive postures, moving more cautiously and avoiding long-range engagements, where the M-36's superior firepower gave it an advantage. This defensive mindset was exactly what Allied commanders had been hoping to achieve. By forcing German armor to become more cautious, the M-36 effectively neutralized much of the tactical advantage that superior armor design had provided. But the Jackson's influence extended far beyond its immediate combat effectiveness. The success of the 90mm gun on the M-36 platform led directly to its adoption on other American vehicles. The M-26 Pershing heavy tank, which began arriving in Europe just as the war was ending, mounted the same gun in a heavily armored turret. Post-war American tank development was heavily influenced by lessons learned from M-36 operations, particularly the importance of long-range firepower and accurate fire control systems. The M-36 also influenced American tank destroyer doctrine for decades after the war. The idea that specialized anti-tank vehicles could be more effective than general-purpose tanks in certain situations became a cornerstone of American military thinking. This philosophy would later influence the development of vehicles like the M18, Hellcat, and various self-propelled anti-tank guns used during the Cold War. International military observers were also taking notes. The British, who had been struggling with their own anti-tank weapons, launched a crash program to develop similar high-velocity guns. The Soviets, who captured several M-36s during the final stages of the war, reverse-engineered many of its features for use in their own tank destroyer programs. Even the Germans, in the final months of the war, began developing similar weapons based on intelligence gathered about the Jackson's capabilities. The technical innovations pioneered on the M-36 found applications far beyond tank warfare. The advanced fire control systems developed for the Jackson influenced post-war artillery design. The power traverse system that allowed the massive gun to track targets quickly became standard on virtually all subsequent American armored vehicles. Even seemingly minor details, like the design of the commander's cupola and the arrangement of crew positions, influenced tank design for decades to come. One aspect of the M-36's design that often gets overlooked is how crew-friendly it was compared to other tank destroyers of the era. The spacious fighting compartment gave crew members room to work efficiently, even during extended combat operations. The well-designed controls and instrumentation reduced crew fatigue and allowed for more accurate gunnery. These human factors considerations were revolutionary for their time and contributed significantly to the vehicle's combat effectiveness. The ammunition handling systems on the M-36 were also ahead of their time. The large bustle at the rear of the turret provided secure storage for ready-use rounds, while the mechanical loading assists reduced crew workload and increased rate of fire. These innovations allowed M-36 crews to sustain high rates of accurate fire for extended periods, which was crucial during intense combat situations like those encountered during the Battle of the Bulge. Maintenance and logistics support for the M-36 was another area where American ingenuity shone through. The vehicle was designed to use as many common components as possible, which simplified supply chains and reduced the burden on maintenance crews. The modular design meant that damaged components could be quickly replaced in the field, keeping more vehicles in action. This reliability and maintainability gave American forces a significant advantage over German units, whose complex vehicles required extensive maintenance and specialized parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain. The training programs developed for M-36 crews became the model for American tank destroyer training throughout the Cold War. The emphasis on marksmanship, tactical flexibility, and aggressive leadership produced some of the finest tank killers in military history. Many M36 veterans went on to become instructors at armor schools, passing their knowledge and experience on to new generations of tank destroyer crews. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the M36 Jackson is what it represented about American industrial and military capability. This was a weapon that went from concept to combat ready in less than 2 years, a timeline that would be considered impossible today. It required innovations in metallurgy, mechanical engineering, fire control systems, and manufacturing techniques. The fact that it worked so well and worked so quickly demonstrated the incredible depth of American technical and industrial resources. The story of the M36 also illustrates the importance of getting the right weapon to the right place at the right time. If the Jackson had arrived 6 months earlier, it might have shortened the war significantly. If it had arrived 6 months later, it would have been too late to make a difference. The timing was perfect, and that perfect timing was the result of thousands of people working together toward a common goal. Looking back at the M36's combat record, certain engagements stand out as particularly significant. The destruction of that first Panther in the Ardennes wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological watershed that changed how both sides viewed armored combat. The long-range kill achieved by Sergeant Pinto demonstrated capabilities that German intelligence had believed impossible. The successful defense of Bastogne showed that American forces could not only survive German armored attacks but defeat them decisively. Each of these engagements contributed to a growing legend that surrounded the M36 and its crews. Stories of Jackson kills spread rapidly through both armies, often growing in the telling. German propaganda tried to downplay the effectiveness of the new American weapon, but their own tank crews knew better. Radio intercepts from German armored units show increasing references to the long gun and growing reluctance to engage in situations where M36s might be present. The intelligence war surrounding the M36 was almost as intense as the shooting war. American forces went to great lengths to prevent intact examples from falling into German hands, while German intelligence made capturing or photographing a Jackson a top priority. When a damaged M36 was finally captured by German forces in early 1945, the detailed examination revealed just how advanced American tank destroyer technology had become German. Engineers were particularly impressed by the sophisticated fire control systems and the quality of the armor-piercing ammunition. Their analysis concluded that the M36 represented a significant technological leap forward and recommended immediate development of countermeasures. However, by that point in the war, Germany lacked the resources and time necessary to respond effectively. The post-war technical analysis of the M36's performance revealed some surprising statistics. The average M36 crew achieved a kill ratio of over 3.1 against German armor, which was remarkable considering they were often outnumbered and operating in enemy territory. The vehicle's mechanical reliability was also outstanding, with availability rates consistently above 85% even under harsh combat conditions. Perhaps more importantly, crew survival rates for M36 units were significantly higher than for most other American armored vehicles. This was surprising given the Jackson's thin armor and open turret, but it reflected the effectiveness of the hit-and-run tactics that M36 crews employed. By engaging at long range and avoiding prolonged firefights, Jackson crews minimized their exposure to enemy fire. The medical records from M36 units also reveal interesting patterns. Crew injuries were most commonly caused by artillery fragments and small arms fire entering the open turret, rather than direct hits from tank guns. This led to the development of various field modifications, including improvised turret roofs and better personal protective equipment for crew members. The psychological impact of operating an M36 was also significant, though in a positive way. Crews reported much higher confidence levels compared to operators of other American armored vehicles. Knowing they had a weapon that could reliably penetrate any German armor gave M36 crews an aggressive mindset that translated into tactical success. This confidence was infectious and contributed to improved morale throughout entire tank destroyer battalions. Training accidents during M36 crew preparation were surprisingly rare, despite the vehicle's powerful armament and complex systems. This reflected the quality of the training programs and the careful selection of crew members. Tank destroyer service attracted some of the best personnel in the American military, men who were motivated, intelligent, and naturally aggressive. The logistics chain supporting M36 operations was a marvel of military efficiency. Special ammunition supply procedures ensured that the precious high-velocity rounds were distributed where they were most needed. Maintenance support was organized around mobile repair teams that could service M36s in forward positions. Replacement crew training was accelerated to keep pace with combat losses and unit expansion. One often overlooked aspect of M36 operations was the intelligence gathering conducted by tank destroyer crews. Their advanced optics and forward positions made them excellent observation platforms, and many crews supplemented their tank-killing activities with reconnaissance and artillery spotting duties. This intelligence was invaluable for planning larger operations and understanding German defensive patterns. The M36's influence on post-war military thinking extended far beyond tank destroyer doctrine. The success of the 90mm gun led to its adoption for air defense systems, where its high velocity and accuracy made it excellent for engaging jet aircraft. Many of the fire control innovations pioneered on the Jackson found their way into early guided missile systems and radar-controlled. Cold War tank development was heavily influenced by lessons learned from M36 operations. The importance of long-range firepower, accurate fire control, and crew survivability became central themes in American tank design. Even today, many of the principles established during the M36's development continue to influence military vehicle design. The international impact of the M36 was also significant. Countries that operated Jacksons after World War II used them as the basis for their own tank destroyer programs. French modifications to their M36s influenced the design of subsequent French armored vehicles. South Korean experience with Jacksons during the Korean War shaped their approach to defensive operations for decades to come. But beyond all the technical achievements and combat statistics, the M36 Jackson represents something more fundamental about American military capability. This was a weapon system that succeeded because it combined technological innovation with tactical flexibility and individual courage. The engineers who designed it, the factory workers who built it, and the crews who operated it all contributed to its success. The story of the M36 also demonstrates the importance of learning from combat experience and adapting quickly to changing conditions. The weapon emerged from careful analysis of battlefield failures and represented a direct response to specific tactical problems. It wasn't developed according to some abstract military theory. It was created to solve real problems that were getting American soldiers killed. As we wrap up this incredible journey through the history of America's most feared tank destroyer, it's worth remembering that the M36 Jackson was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, determination, and industrial might. When the situation looked hopeless, when German supertanks seemed invincible, American engineers and workers pulled together to create a weapon that not only leveled the playing field but tipped it decisively in favor of the Allies, the men who operated these. Machines were heroes in the truest sense of the word. They volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the military, knowing that they would be actively seeking out the most dangerous enemies on the battlefield. Their courage, skill, and determination made the difference between victory and defeat in some of the most critical battles of World War II. Today, as we face new challenges and new threats, the story of the M36 Jackson reminds us of what's possible when free people work together toward a common goal. The same spirit of innovation and determination that created the Jackson continues to drive American military development today. Whether we're talking about advanced fighter aircraft, precision-guided munitions, or next-generation armored vehicles, the principles established during the M36's development continue to influence how we think about military technology. The Jackson's legacy lives on not just in museums and history books, but in the institutional knowledge and traditions of the United States military. Tank destroyer units may no longer exist as separate formations, but the aggressive hunter mentality they pioneered continues to influence American armor tactics. The emphasis on superior firepower, accurate gunnery, and tactical flexibility remains central to how American forces approach armored warfare. So the next time you see an M36 Jackson in a museum or read about its exploits during World War II, remember that you're looking at more than just an old tank destroyer. You're looking at a symbol of what Americans can accomplish when they put their minds to it. The Jackson proved that with enough determination, ingenuity, and courage, even the most impossible challenges can be overcome. And that, my friends, is a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was in the frozen forests of the Ardennes over 75 years ago. The M36 Jackson wasn't just America's Panther killer. It was proof that when Americans are faced with an impossible situation, they don't give up. They innovate, they adapt, and they win. If this incredible story of American innovation and battlefield heroism has gotten you as fired up as it's gotten me, then you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel right now. We're constantly digging up these amazing forgotten stories of military history, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that notification bell too, because YouTube's algorithm loves to bury military history content. And the only way you'll see our latest videos is if you tell the algorithm you want to see them. And here's something else you can do to help. Share this video with anyone you know who loves military history. Whether it's your grandfather who served in World War II, your buddy who's into tanks, or that coworker who's always talking about historical documentaries, send them this link. These stories deserve to be told, and they deserve to be heard by as many people as possible. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought about the M36 Jackson. Do you think it was the most underrated weapon of World War II? What other forgotten pieces of military hardware do you think deserve the spotlight? Your comments help drive our future content, and I read every single one of them. The story of the M36 Jackson proves that sometimes the most incredible weapons are the ones you've never heard of. While everyone talks about the Sherman tank or the German Tiger, it was machines like the Jackson that actually won the war. These are the stories that matter, the forgotten heroes and hidden weapons that change the course of history. And we're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.